disappeared. We're going to go ahead and begin this morning because we have another action-filled conference today. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Pat Shipman. Dr. Shipman is an internationally known paleoanthropologist specializing in the formation of fossil sites, who has conducted research for many years in Africa on human evolution and the animal communities in which humans evolved. She has written more than 60 scholarly articles, 100 newspaper and magazine articles, and her books have won numerous awards, with her most recent science book, The Invaders, being named Book of the Week by The Week in the U.S. and Times Higher Education in the UK. And today, Dr. Shipman is going to be speaking about evolving with our companions, dogs, and people. Please welcome Dr. Shipman. I don't know anything about the technology.
It's okay. Good morning, everybody. Very brave of you to all be here. Now, the one thing I need to do is make this left-hand thing disappear. Now that's... Sorry? I'm not sorry. Sorry, I should have asked about this. That's all right, don't worry about it. Good. Thank you, Cindy. Okay, now, I thought I would open my talk by saying, now for something completely different. Because I'm not talking about the current situation, I'm not talking about legislation, I'm not talking about animal welfare. I'm actually talking about how humans first became intimately involved with animals. And that is the subject of my book, The Invaders, here, which you can all buy on Amazon. And the reason I call the book The Invaders is because we, modern humans, are a highly invasive species. Now, legally an invasive species, have I got a pointer? Yes. Okay, is defined as one that is non-native or alien to the ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. I would argue that we have been more destructive of habitats worldwide than any other species you can think of. We evolved in Eastern Africa about 200,000 years ago. This is a reconstruction of one of the first individuals that we have in the fossil record, and all we can go on is the ones that happen to be preserved. And this individual was found in Ethiopia. They're somewhat near Hadar, 200,000 years ago. And what did we do? We started moving out of Africa reasonably rapidly. Of course, we didn't know Africa was a continent. We didn't know we were moving out of it, but that is what we did. So if you look at it objectively from an overall ecological perspective, we are kudzu, we are cane toads, we are zebra mussels, we are Burmese pythons, we are lionfish. We are moving out of the place we evolved and where we belonged into virtually every other habitat in the world. This is a simplified diagram just to reinforce that message. All the red area in Africa is where we know early modern humans evolved. And when I say modern, remember I'm talking 200,000 years ago. By at least 100,000 years ago, we had moved into the Arabian Peninsula and started moving into Europe, into Asia, eventually into Australia and Greater Australia and the Pacific, and even later into the Americas. This is an amazing distribution if you know anything about mammals. This is totally non-normal, and we've been wildly successful doing it, witness the 7 billion plus humans that are alive today. And you have to say, what's going to be the effect when a species, particularly a top predator, because this is what we evolved to be, joins an ecosystem that has been evolving without it for millennia? This is based on the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone, which is one of the best documented instances of a top predator coming into a well-studied ecosystem, and then enormous numbers of studies of what that impact is on the whole ecosystem. And you can say when we brought back wolves, which of course had historically been in Yellowstone before we shot them all out, you see two kinds of effects, positive ones and negative ones. For coyotes, their population dropped by 50% because canids, doggy animals, are extremely territorial and extremely alert to the presence of other canids, and wolves killed or drove out a lot of coyotes. What that did was it meant there were more pronghorn antelopes surviving and more small mammals surviving, because those were the animals that the coyotes favored as prey. On the other hand, wolves go to elk, one of the largest mammalian herbivores available in the park, and their numbers declined. Fewer elk were surviving. But what that did was that brought back some of the natural vegetation along the waterways, which was the nesting area for songbirds and which were heavily utilized by beavers. Elk had just mowed that vegetation down before because their numbers were so high. So what hitting on the elk does, it brings back vegetation that's been declining and increases the number of songbirds and beavers. Because the elk are getting hammered by the wolves, there are more carcasses around, particularly in winter, which is the tough season for everybody. This is more carcasses for bears, for scavenging birds, and we have more of these animals surviving, breeding, being healthy. So what we thought this well-studied ecosystem looked like was in fact out of balance, because the apex predator, the wolf, had been eliminated by humans. Bringing them back has, of course, been a cause of great aggravation to the ranchers who live right around Yellowstone, because they've been there, some of them for generations, without wolves. And now they find they have to guard their livestock against wolves. One of them said to me, "Well, how would you feel if I plunked down a wolf in your backyard?" And I admit I wouldn't be all that happy about it. On the other hand, they have had very low-cost grazing for a long time, and there are compensation mechanisms available if wolves take your livestock. So it's not quite such a, I understand why they resent it, but it's not quite such a hardship as they feel it is. Okay, so by analogy, given that we know that about what happened when wolves came in, what do we expect when a new apex predator came into Pleistocene Europe, which started about 50,000 years ago? We expect increased competition for all kinds of resources: prey, living areas, good access to water, dens or protected areas for raising babies, which are used by multiple species. We expect a population drop in the main prey species. We expect to see possible changes in vegetation and habitat, which at that point in time was also aggravated by a bad era in climate. And we expect to see a change in the distribution of prey species due to those two factors. The vegetation may be changing because it's getting colder. This is what people call the Ice Age. There were a lot of ice ages. And there is more intense competition in the whole system, particularly among the predators. Now, the predator that really got hammered when humans came in, and you can show this statistically by looking at the fossil and archaeological record. I know this is virtually impossible to read from the back of the room, but it saved me making 3 different slides. Neanderthals were also part of that European ecosystem. They had been there since about 300,000 years ago. So they'd been there a long time before modern humans came in. They were very, very like us. They had weapons, they had tools, they used fire. They lived in family groups. They almost certainly hunted communally, which changes the odds of what you're going to get and how easily you're going to get it. But within a very short time after modern human came in, if you compared the sites between humans, which had been at 0 before 50,000, and Neanderthals, you find interesting things. The Neanderthal sites were smaller, that is, the human sites were bigger, implying that more people were there. They are full of more sophisticated stone tools, and they contain more remains of animal prey. In other words, almost as soon as we got there, we did better in objective measures than the human-like species that have been living there for 200,000 years. The Neanderthals were the coyotes when we were the wolves. They were the ones most like us. They were the ones that suffered most from the competition because we hunted the same animals with very similar tools in very similar ways, sometimes very, very close to where the Neanderthals were, and we were better at it. So what makes the difference? And I would say this, our arrival is the beginning of the end for Neanderthals. They were gone by 40,000 years, gone everywhere, extinct, and you can watch their decline through time. But we're looking at the same period of time, the same habitat, the same prey species, the same climate, similar tools. What's the difference? What I propose, and I have to be honest here, not everybody believes me, it's dogs. And I will now present you with the evidence that says it's the onset of the domestication of dogs. Now, all those dog people, dog fanciers, dog breeders in the audience, I am not talking about your dogs. I am talking about the beginning of dogs. I am talking about wolves that are starting to behave peculiarly for wolves and that come to an arrangement, a negotiation, an alliance with modern humans. So this is some of the first evidence that set me on this course. Oops, sorry. A very clever friend of mine, a paleontologist in Belgium, who studied this time period through fossils, and she got interested in whether or not any of the wolves that had been identified in the fossil record at this time period, 50, 40,000 years ago, 35, were actually early dogs. Now, telling dogs from wolves when all you have is a skeleton, and usually a partial skeleton, is a very tricky thing. What she did was she used some fairly sophisticated statistical methods, which I will not go into so you can all breathe a sigh of relief. And she found that if you took a series of measurements on these skulls, there are the nose ends, there's the back end, nose, back, you could statistically distinguish something that was more like a dog than like a wolf. They were weird wolves. She has now identified more than 40 specimens, so it's not like she's got one. She's got 40, she's got them from several different sites. And if they are splitting about 40,000 years ago, which is when these weird wolves turn up, I'm sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button here. No, go forward, don't do that. Ooh. Okay, there we go. There were wolves there, but there were also something she calls Paleolithic dogs. I call wolf dogs. I do not mean wolf and dog hybrids. I mean something that isn't a dog that you all have. It's not a wolf that's wandering around Yellowstone. It's something somewhere in between. And so, to be formal about it, I put forward a hypothesis that this distinct group of wolf dogs lived and hunted cooperatively with early modern humans, playing a major role in their success. And the reason there is that lovely mammoth there is because one of the things that starts happening is mammoths start turning up in large numbers in human sites. Mammoths are pretty rare before that. I mean, not that they don't live out there, but as kills. Now, this brings us to what makes a wolf and what makes a dog a dog. How come that's not a wolf? How come that's not a dog? The early dogs that Mecha has found differ in skull shape, in the ones where they could get DNA out, which is a good trick if it's 40,000 years old. They differ in genetics, and they apparently differ in diet from the wolves at the same site. So there is a coherent group. The implication is that there has been a genetic change and that there is a behavioral change. And that's the beginning of domestication, I would argue. Now, what makes a wolf and a dog a dog? There is a slightly biased photograph of a wolf and a German shepherd together, and you will notice they're a whole bunch bigger if they're wolves. Here are some paw prints. Again, a coyote, a big dog, a wolf. There's a very clear size differential. So I would argue that what a dog is a wolf who has decided, who adapts to live with humans. It is the intimacy with humans that makes them dogs and not wolves. And here are a few images just to remind you there are a lot of different ways to live with humans. And this beautiful illustration, and I'll show some others, is by a gifted artist called Dan Burr. I give him credit because he lets me use his images, and they're really accurate in terms of what we know. So the big difference, what makes a dog is its behavior and its attitude towards humans. Puppies are drawn to humans. We love puppies. They like people. Wolf puppies, unless you get them extremely early before their eyes and ears are opened, don't like people very much. They're afraid of people. Dogs are our companions, and they live in our homes, like these two beautiful dogs. When you give them intelligence tasks, they look to humans for instruction or for approval. Wolves don't do that. Wolves are not human-centric. Dogs are. And this is partly that genetic change that we can detect. Now, there are a lot of animals that have been domesticated. And the reason I'm talking about dogs is not just because I'm here among so many people who love dogs, but because, in fact, dogs are the first domesticate ever, and they are the most important. And they are the ones that have continued to live in the most intimate relations with humans. So when you talk to people who study domestication, they're talking about cows, they're talking about goats, they're talking about sheep. Nuh-uh. If you want to know what domestication is, look at the first time it ever happened, when nobody had ever before made this kind of living alliance with another species. That's a really interesting and bold thing to do. After it's been done once, maybe you think it's, you get the concept that you could do this if you pick the right target species, because as many of you will know, there are species that people have tried over and over to domesticate, and they don't wanna. They're not gonna, you can't make them do it. No. So you have to start with the right species. Now I have to say, if you wanted a dog to sit in its bed by the fire, or to go to shows with you, or to go for walks with you, sit in the cafe restaurant at your feet like a good dog, you don't start with a wolf. Wolves are a really stupid choice. And if you want to be sure of where dinner is coming from, and you don't want to have to run through the woods hunting something, you want it out in the back, maybe in some kind of pen or confinement, wolves are a really bad choice. They grow up very slowly. They don't have very big litters. Wolves in nature have pack arrangements, and usually only one female is breeding at a time. So if what you want to do is produce meat, you don't start with a wolf. So how does this work? This is a wonderful photograph from Yellowstone. What you see in modern wolves, they do have a pack order. They will find, isolate, surround, and harass large prey like bison. We don't unfortunately have mammoths in Yellowstone now. And you can see from all the footprints, this has been going on for hours. This bison is going nowhere. It might go a little bit this way, a little bit that way. A dog might come in and bite its bum, and it goes forward, whatever. But they harass them. They hold them. If this were a deliberate hunting episode, you would be telling the dog to hold the prey. And of course, they're finding them faster because they're dogs and not sensory nitwits like humans. This is known wolf behavior. You don't have to do anything to a wolf to get it to do this. What you have to do is get it to cooperate with its human companions. Once they have found and held and harassed the prey, humans have distance weapons. This means as a wolf, or as an early dog, you don't have to run in and try to pull that animal down, which is where they get hurt all the time. All you have to do is hold it, and people come in with their spears and their bows and arrows. When those developed, they kill it, then it's down, then you share the carcass. This is a win-win. If you can just get over that thing of sharing your carcass. Now, why would anybody do this? Why would we do this? Why would they do this? First of all, it lessens everybody's risk. There are fewer life-threatening injuries. You get more prey. Your capture rate is higher. The hunts don't go on as long. The wolves, or the wolf dogs, guard the carcass. They're not going to give it up. That means you don't have to cut the damn thing up and hump it back to wherever you're camping and hope nobody follows you and eats you with this nice hunk of meat on your back en route. And finally, what really matters evolutionarily for everybody involved in this transaction is there's more energy for reproduction because you're getting more food, you're getting it with less expenditure of energy, with less risk, So if you can develop the communication system, if you can negotiate the arrangement with the other species, this is a very profitable enterprise. Now, considering how badly we misunderstand each other with spoken speech when we are all one species, this is not an easy proposition. But it can be done, and most people I know who work with animals feel they are developing a common language. So, have we got evidence of this? And I put these predictions out some years ago, and so far, nobody has come up with contrary evidence. Some of them don't like the original classification of wolves and early dogs. Some of them argue statistics. Some of them say, well, you know, you're just getting weird wolves. Maybe, but we see some of these other things too. For example, we're not finding wolf dogs at archaeological sites before modern humans get into Europe. Sites without wolf dogs are smaller, have lower tool densities, have fewer bones of prey. Sites with wolf dogs are at or nearer the kill sites when you can tell where the kill site was than sites without wolf dogs. Sites with wolf dogs will have remains of larger prey species, including mammoths, and this is where things get really weird. In the archaeological record, you have 1, maybe 2 mammoths in an archaeological site made by any kind of human. All of a sudden, you get these sites with dozens of mammoths. They're absolutely astonishing. And in fact, there are many where the humans have gone back, presumably after some time has elapsed, and they use the bones as building materials. And they build these amazing mammoth bone huts. And the reason I say it's after some time lapse is I wouldn't want to do that if all the bones were fresh. And in fact, the bones are not chewed in these huts, so you know they're old, because if they weren't old, somebody would come along and try to get the last bits of meat off it. These things are bizarre, and they occur at sites with dozens and sometimes hundreds of dead mammoths. That can't be a single event. I mean, you know that. There's no way to do that. Anybody who knows elephants here, and there are some very knowledgeable people, you can't kill 200 elephants in one episode with machine guns. And you sure as hell can't do it with spears. Humans also, because they've made this alliance with the wolf dogs, target and kill wild canids because wolves are, and this is still inherited, are so territorial. That means when you move around with them, because nobody's got fixed villages or permanent settlements or anything except these crazy huts that are seasonally used, they move around. They have to be moving into territories of packs of wolves. There has to be a defense against them. And that's what's happening. They become the ones that humans in alliance with the wolf dogs kill off. And incidentally, they have very nice fur, which is always handy in an ice age. Now, here we get to some really interesting things. I should have said long before, this is not all my work. I am pulling together work by tens of people. So don't think I'm so clever I've done all this on my own. You would expect evidence that wolf dogs and humans living with them have developed enhanced means of communications. Now, this is still out there dangling in the wind, waiting for somebody to confirm it or refute it. Of primates, and this is a chimpanzee, only humans have whites to their eyes. There are disease conditions that give chimps yellowy, whitey sclera, but it's not the same thing. What being built like a human does is it makes it obvious what your direction of gaze is. And, okay, I'll look at you. You know I'm looking at you. If I do that, you know I'm looking somewhere else, even if I don't move my head. You can follow my intentions by reading the direction of gaze. Dogs do this really well. And a couple of Japanese researchers did a large study of all kinds of canids, and they found there were different arrangements of the color of the iris, the color of the sclera, the sort of what you think of as mascara around the eyes, and then the fur around that. The ones that are pack livers, that is, live together in groups and function in groups, have a striking difference. They don't have white sclera, but they do have eyes that contrast sharply with the tissues around them, so it is easier to see their direction of gaze. The ones that live singly have, you see a contrast there, but you can't tell which way that fennec is looking. Some of them that are loners, the eyes are almost kind of camouflaged. So I would predict that when modern humans start living with other animals, as an enhanced means of communication, they develop white sclera. Now, the artists who draw these early human types don't much like that idea. They, even if they're talking about something that's clearly pre-human, they want them to have a white sclera so they look more human. But I don't think that's the case. And someday, somebody is going to find out what gene causes that sclera to be white and when it develops. Now, here's a fascinating study. This is really fun. Up the vertical are the number of copies of amylase genes. Amylase genes have to do with digesting carbohydrates. If you are a wolf, you don't get a lot of carbohydrates. If you are a domestic dog, depending on the group with which you are living, you may get a lot of carbohydrates. So here are, I've forgotten the number, 100 and something species of dogs. And some of them have very high numbers of copies of this amylase gene, and some of them don't have very many. This green area is dingoes, which are arguably domestic dogs gone feral, and are arguably no such thing, but dogs domesticated under an entirely different ecosystem and regime. And if you notice, all these red things are wolves. In other words, dingoes are like wolves in having a very low dependence on carbohydrates, a low ability to digest them. But the domestic dogs you all have up to very large numbers of copies of these genes, which is the excuse for putting fillers in dog food. They may actually need it. Little did we know. But this also implies that the ancestral condition is very poor digestion of carbohydrates, very low dependence on it, and that changes very dramatically when dogs start living with people, because people like carbohydrates. Now, this is another beautiful Dan Burr illustration. What I'm arguing really is that the domestication of dogs may explain human survival in the long run. That is why we survived and Neanderthals under the same conditions go extinct. That is why we can adapt to different habitats, different ecosystems, different resources around the world. It's because we do it with our dogs. They are our companions, they are our helpmeets, we are theirs. I mean, it's not just that we get the good end of the stick and they get the short end. After all, dogs get sofas. Dogs get regular meals. They get petting and loving and amusement, all of which they like a lot. So that is my argument in a nutshell. We are here today because of dogs. That is one of the biggest developments in all of human evolution. Thank you so much. And I will take, yes.
Thank you. It's a great story, and it's one I tell my animal science students as we talk
good.
about domestication. This cooperative hunting activity is particularly compelling. So I know you know much better than I do that some of the burial sites that have shown the dog, especially the Neanderthals.
Aren't those amazing?
What was published just a few years ago, 4 years ago, I think, was a site about 3,000 years prior to the Natufian site where a fox skeleton was found. And in that case, what was really intriguing was that it was clear that the fox had been moved with the person who was in the burial site, and the head of the fox from the original site was moved along with the person, suggesting the special relationship between the fox and people. And so it's interesting that there's not more stories, more evidence about a relationship with humans and foxes prior to humans and wolves. Do you have any comments on that?
I do. I know exactly the article you're talking about, and there are these almost one-off situations where a particular animal has been interred deliberately like a human, sometimes with grave goods. There's one wonderful one where the dog is wearing a necklace. I mean, it's clearly a dog necklace. It's not a person necklace. And so later in time that I'm talking about, starting about 15,000 years ago, and going up to very recently, a few hundred years ago, you find these burial sites or even whole cemeteries where there are people and there are dogs, and sometimes they're in the same grave together, and sometimes it's not a dog, it's a fox. It's some special other animal that clearly had an intimate relationship with the human who is buried there. Maybe people are trying out domesticating foxes. I recently wrote an article about Channel Island foxes, which are alive and well today, and I urge you to go see them the next time you're in California, because they're wonderful little foxes. They live only on the Channel Islands. They were originally brought there by the Chumash Indians because they can't possibly get there from shore. It's too far. And they're petite, little, lovely things. They're totally unafraid of people. And so there is a lot of discussion about whether or not Channel Island foxes are domesticated. They were certainly held sacred by Chumash Indians. They were involved in a lot of ceremonies and other stuff. But people in my field talk of this as dogs acquiring personhood. And I think anybody who has kept a number of different animals know that personhood is not something that just pertains to formally domesticated animals. Lots of animals have personhood.
Excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. I would take one small little exception to what you said, because I believe that most of us in this room are carrying Neanderthal genes.
Oh, we are. And that's a very interesting issue. I was hoping somebody was going to ask that, so thank you. Clearly, well, no, that's not even true. It is not clear. There was not only hostility between Neanderthals and modern humans. Somebody was out in the bushes making hybrid babies. Whether or not that was a voluntary arrangement, I'm not even sure how I'd try to investigate that. There is evidence, and it's a little bit picked and chosen, that hybrid Neanderthal human males would have diminished fertility. And that would be a very interesting way to outcompete your rival, because the male babies apparently didn't survive very well or were themselves not very fertile. So yes, many of us have Neanderthal genes. I haven't had my genome done to know, but I wouldn't be terribly surprised. Yes, ma'am.
I'm really fascinated by this revelation about the amylase genes. First question, how many do the New Guinea singing dogs have?
Very low numbers. People don't, admittedly, people don't test them a lot because there aren't so many of them accessible to test.
I don't know any New Guinea singing dogs personally, but I have read, everybody make note, Google dogs in elk. It'll kill you. Don't do it while you're in the room because you'll collapse in laughter.
Really?
It involves a New Guinea singing dog named Gus who decided to occupy an elk carcass, and it's a scream.
I gotta find this.
in the amylase gene category, as we categorize dogs, sporting, working, herding, terrier, do those groupings have correspondingly similar numbers to the dogs in the group?
Sometimes, and sometimes they don't.
Okay.
It's not a good marker for that.
Okay.
I should say that Samoyeds have very low numbers, but the Samoyed is a far north dog, originally, if I believe the stories, originally developed and bred by Inuits and Aleuts and other far northern people who do not have a lot of carbohydrates in their diets, much less that they'd feed it to the dog. So that's an instance where the lifestyle of the people put no selective pressure on having lots of amylase genes or having very few. It's very interesting to me that you can't separate out the working dogs from the non-working dogs.
What we call the toy and the non-sporting breeds, are they similar to each other? Can you differentiate them from the hunting dogs?
Not,
the ones that have a job?
Not very readily, and yet the people who have studied the development of different breed dogs, which, as you probably all know, is only a few hundred years old. That's not a deeply ancient division of dogs. What the genetics tells us is that if you wanted to produce a better sighthound, for example, you crossbred two sighthounds. So that there is a more ancient than you would expect trace genetically of the jobs that dogs were supposed to perform. And the toy and miniature dogs, that is a very specific genetic trait that clearly somebody stumbled upon and started crossbreeding those to get very little, petite, extremely adorable dogs, rather than a lurcher that would be big and a little ungainly, but great hunting dog.
Thank you.
Sure,
this is
thank you.
fascinating.
First of all, I just wanted to thank you. This is absolutely fascinagoing.
Well,
and
thank
I
you.
assume you can all go on Amazon to get
Yes.
this book?
Oh,
Great.
yes.
Wonderful. I'm going to go do that because I think it's fascinating. The other thing I would mention is we talked about precision with language yesterday. I would suggest that using the term personhood when referring to dogs, particularly among people who are very, very aware of problems with animal rights, and it's a term that's used a lot by animal rights.
Yeah, it is.
Typically when getting into, legal issues. probably may not be the term that would be best to use in this case, but I would just instead focus on that wonderful bond and ability to communicate.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I'm always a little startled when people in my field talk about personhood for animals, because it is so involved with those other issues, which I don't want to talk about here.
Well, you know, and it's good for you to say that, because that's something we all need to be aware of, is that
Yes.
when that term is being used anthropologically, we need to stand up and say,
Yeah, right.
let's
Maybe
do a
not.
little education about
I would
this.
also say, while I'm on the soapbox, I hate the word domestication because it is used for animals and plants. Now, if I want to make, and somebody talked earlier about GMOs, for example, if I want to make better maize, if I want to make better tomatoes, domesticating a tomato is just not the same as domesticating a wolf. It's not even in the same ballpark. And so I think it's a, you know, I want another word, and if somebody has one, I would be delighted to hear it. I keep asking groups of people for this, and they say, well, you could say it's a reciprocal arrangement. Yes. Stephen Budiansky talks about the covenant, and I use the word alliance or covenant or negotiated arrangement a lot, but I'd really like another word because I just don't think we talk about tomatoes the way we talk about even cows. I mean, it's just, it's not the same. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
You people give me all these goodies.